Welcome to a reading from the Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart. Today we'll be reading the chapter, Everything as It Should Be. Before supper the next day, the Mysterious Benedict Society, hopeful for clues, climbed the hill beyond the gym to take a look around. It was quite a high hill, but if you moved at a quick pace, and Kate always moved at a quick pace, even with Constance riding piggyback, you could follow the winding path to the summit in a matter of minutes. This Kate did, with Rainy and Sticky panting along behind her at some distance. By the time the boys reached the top, she was already surveying the area with her spyglass. Rainy mopped his brow. See anything? Kate shrugged. Grass and rocks, bushes and rocks, vines and rocks, sand and rocks, lots of rocks, she said, lowering the spyglass. Then ever so casually she added, I also found another trap. A trap? Sticky said, glancing all around, as if the trap might sneak up and grab him. Don't worry, it's way down there, in a little grassy area behind the Institute Control Building. You can't see it from anywhere else, but if you aim the spyglass over the roof of the classroom building, you can just see it. She offered the spyglass to Sticky, who declined. He didn't care to see any more traps. Rainy took a look, though, and sure enough, for this spot you could just make out the telltale drapeweed and boulders behind the building. Rainy returned the spyglass to her. I wonder why both traps are right next to a group of boulders. Don't you think it's to make them harder to see? Kate said. By moonlight or sunlight, the drapeweed would almost always be in shadow. Crafty, said Constance. Drapeweed was the perfect choice then, said Sticky. It's a shade-loving plant. Put away the spyglass, Rainy murmured. We have company. 2 helpers had appeared on the path below them, each lugging 2 buckets full of gardening tools. They were making their slow way up the hill, clearing weeds and debris from the paths. As they drew near, they moved wordlessly to the edge of the path, so as not to disturb the children. Good afternoon, Rainy said, forgetting that he usually avoided greeting helpers. He was nervous about the spyglass, and he wanted to seem casual. The helpers, a man and a woman, glanced at Rainy with fearful suspicion. To ease their worries, he smiled good-naturedly and gave a little wave, then immediately regretted it. The helpers, feeling compelled to reciprocate, stopped walking and set down their buckets so they could wave back. Nice buckets, Kate said. Thank you, miss. They do the job, said one of the helpers, a short, rotund man who looked rather like a bullfrog and sounded even more like one. At the sound of his voice, Rainy started. He knew this man. He took a step closer and peered at his face. The helper took a step backward and averted his eyes. Mr. Bloomberg? Rainy said. I almost didn't recognize you. Greatly discomfited, the helper turned to his partner, a wisp of a woman who seemed to be trying to hide behind her hair. Is he speaking to you? Have you gone mad? The woman hissed, first rolling her eyes at her partner, then flashing a miserable conciliatory smile at the children. She made an effort to speak calmly. He said, Mr. Didn't you, young man? Anyway, my name's not Bloomberg. Well, neither is mine, said the man, and looking at the ground near Rainy's feet, he said, Please don't take offense, but my name is Harry Harrison. You aren't Mr. Bloomberg? I don't mean to be contrary, said Harry Harrison. The other helper signaled her vigorous agreement, and I hope you won't be displeased, but no. The other children were staring at Rainy, who seemed dreadfully confused. But, how long have you worked here? The helper glanced at his partner. A long time, wouldn't you say, Mary? I know I've been here a long time, the woman said, looking at the ground, and you've been here for most of that, so yes. I hope that's okay, said Harry. But how long exactly? Rainy pressed. I'm sorry, Harry said, and he did indeed seem very sorry. I don't believe I remember the exact date. Do you, Mary? The exact date? No, but certainly a long time. Rainy put his hands on his head. You've never visited Stonetown Orphanage? You seem agitated, said Mary in a worried tone. I'm sorry if we've upset you. Aren't we sorry, Harry? Very sorry indeed, said Harry miserably. We didn't mean to bother you. You haven't upset me, said Rainey, sounding very upset. But you are not, but are you not troubled that you can't remember exactly when you came here? At this, both helpers shook their heads and said, everything is just as it should be. The children's eyes widened. But the helpers seemed unaware of the oddity of their response. They were only waiting to be dismissed, hoping the children would not abuse them or get them into trouble. I'm glad to hear that, Rainey said at last. He seemed finally to be recovering. He even managed to chuckle and say, I'm sorry, I'm really a dunce. You just look so much like him. This person I used to know. Obviously, I've made a mistake. Nice talking to you, though. The helpers were relieved. Oh, indeed. Very nice. A great pleasure, they said, taking up their buckets and hurrying down the other side of the hill. Okay, what was that all about? Asked Kate when they were out of earshot. Rainey's brows were knitted with concentration. That was Mr. Bloomberg, no doubt about it. His face, his shape, that froggy voice. There's no question it was him. And yet he pretended not to know me, pretended not to be himself. Now, why would he do that? Maybe he's a secret agent, Constance said. You know, like Milligan was. And you were blowing his cover. Mr. Bloomberg? Rainey said, I doubt it. He did kind of remind me of Milligan, though, Sticky said. Did anyone else notice how sad he seemed? How sad they both seemed? In their eyes, I mean. I'd never gotten a good look at a helper's eyes before. They're always looking away. But with those two, I could plainly see it. That's true, Kate reflected. I don't think I've ever seen anyone so sad as Milligan. But these two came awfully close. Rainey, do you think... Rainey, what's wrong? The color had drained from Rainey's face. He stood staring off into the distance at nothing in particular, and indeed he looked as if nothingness were exactly what he wished to see. Are you okay? Sticky said. Rainey didn't answer. He had finally come to understand something that would have seemed obvious had it not seemed impossible. Milligan, the missing agents, Mr. Bloomberg, they had all had their memories stolen. Once this had occurred to him, a great many puzzle pieces suddenly fit together. When Milligan was captured, he thought Mr. Curtin discovered his amnesia, when in fact Mr. Curtin had caused it. That was why Mr. Curtin got so angry when Milligan said his memory was fine. Mr. Curtin had wanted to steal his memory or wipe it away, or whatever it was that might be done to memories, and then retrain him as a helper, just like the other agents. Mr. Curtin had transformed all those meddlesome people into his own private workforce, and they didn't even realize it. The helpers had been programmed to believe that everything is as it should be, but you could see it in their eyes. Their lost lives, their lost families, something inside them missed those things terribly. Rainey, you're worrying us, said Kate. What's the matter, Rainey? At last, Rainey's eyes focused, and he turned to his friends and told them what he'd just realized. Kate, Sticky, and Constance stood dumbfounded, struggling just as Rainey had to accept that such a thing was possible. And yet, once you believed it was possible, so many things could be explained. It finally made sense how the special recruits, if they'd been kidnapped, could seem so untroubled. They had been kidnapped, all right, they just didn't remember it. And Charlie Peters, he had seemed so dazed, just like the special recruits on their first day, and then so disturbed when the boys asked him about special privileges. I can't say, he'd told them. He was disturbed because he really couldn't say. He couldn't remember. This is crazy, but it all seems to fit, Kate said, pacing on the path. Except, why aren't the special recruits as sad as the helpers? They seem pretty happy to be here. Charlie didn't seem that sad either, Sticky reflected. He got upset, but he wasn't really sad. It must be different for Lucaner amnesia. Maybe... Wait a minute, Constance demanded. Back up and say that again in human words. Lucaner amnesia? It means you can't remember a specific event. That explains it, Rainey said. You only get sad if you can't remember all the things that are dear to you. If you only lose a little of your memory, you just get confused for a while. Confused, but not sad. That's exactly how I feel right now, said Kate. Who is Mr. Bloomberg, Rainey? Why is he here? He was a school facilities inspector. He'd come around the orphanage every 6 months or so. Mr. Rutger was afraid of him, afraid he'd find something wrong and the orphanage would have to pay for repairs. But Mr. Bloomberg was a good man. Always laughing, always talking. He chatted constantly with anyone who'd listen. And afterward, he'd give the kids ginger snaps. A very friendly, very kind man. Rainey trailed off. He gazed across the harbor channel toward the mainland, as if by gazing he might somehow get back there, and not just to the land, but to a time when he didn't know all the things he knew now. What was he talking about all the time? Kate asked. His children, Rainey said. Oh, said Kate soberly. He loved them dearly, said Rainey, and now look at him, afraid of every child he sees. It's not even a year since I saw him last. Kate was putting it together. So Mr. Bloomberg came to the Institute to make an inspection, which was never supposed to happen, and he didn't like what he found. And Mr. Curtin made sure that he never went back. Rainey finished. But how could Mr. Bloomberg forget his children? Sticky protested. It doesn't seem possible. Can it really be possible? Can any of this be possible? Rainey made no reply. I just can't believe it, said Sticky, wishing he really couldn't. We're going to read the next chapter, which is called Of Families Lost and Found. The mood of their meeting that night was subdued. No bickering, no laughter, only a general feeling of grim resolve. Now that the children finally knew some things, they all rather missed not knowing them. If only they had proof of what they knew. But all they had was their word. The word of children, they knew, amounted to nothing. If the authorities wouldn't listen to Mr. Benedict, they certainly wouldn't listen to children. Rainey and the others could argue all day that Mr. Curtin was erasing people's memories, that dozens of government agents were being held captive on No Man's Island. But they couldn't begin to explain why it was all happening. And without proof, no one would help them try to find out. If we could lay our hands on that journal, Kate had said, do you think that would be proof enough? Fat chance, said Sticky. Mr. Curtin always has it with him. Anyway, even if we stole it and convinced people to read it, said Rainey, they'd think it was a hoax. Mr. Curtin's messages have made sure of that. At least we could read it, Kate said. You know it's chock full of information, and some of it might be exactly what Mr. Benedict needs. She sighed. But you're right, swiping it would be too risky. I wish we could do something, though. We're doing all we can, aren't we? Sticky said. We're telling Mr. Benedict everything we know. Speaking of that, said Rainey, we should send our report. There's a lot to tell. So much to tell, in fact, that Sticky was complaining of a blister on his finger by the time he'd finished the report. A few minutes later, a reply flashed from the mainland trees. What has been lost may yet be found. Have hope. Is he saying he has hope, said Constance irritably, or is he telling us to have hope? Either way, Rainey said, I think he believes those people might be able to get their memories back. Maybe he thinks he can find a way to do it. That's a pretty hopeful thing, isn't it? Assuming we can stop whatever Mr. Curtin's up to, Sticky said. Constance stood up. You are not helping my hopefulness. George Washington, I'm going to bed. She frowned at the ceiling, then looked at Kate. I'll need a ride. After the meeting was adjourned and the girls had gone, Sticky and Rainey climbed into their bunks. Rainey hardly felt like sleeping, but he did need to calm down and clear his thoughts. And so, lying in his bunk, he turned to his usual method. He wrote a mental letter. Dear Miss Perumal, every time I think of poor Mr. Bloomberg and his family, my mind returns to you. How would your mother, whom I know you love so much, feel if you suddenly vanished from her life? It is an awful thing to consider. She loves and depends upon you, and I know you depend upon her too. I never think of you without remembering your mother too. With these thoughts on my mind, I had a strange feeling earlier tonight. Looking around at Sticky, Kate, and Constance, I wondered how I'd feel if one of them disappeared. Sometimes Constance drives me crazy, but now I can't imagine being here without her. I can't say for sure because I have no experience, but, well, is this what family is like? The feeling that everyone's connected? That with one piece missing, the whole thing's broken? Rainey paused in his letter to consider. Of the 4 of them, Sticky was the only one to have a memory of family life. Was it worse for him, Rainey wondered, to have felt loved and then rejected? Or was it worse to have always felt alone? Kate said she had no memory of her dead mother, nor of her father who abandoned her. And Constance, well, they knew almost nothing of Constance, but Rainey had the feeling that she, too, had never known a family. Rainey's mind went back to his last night at Mr. Benedict's house. It seemed so long ago now, yet he remembered it with absolute clarity. Much like tonight, he had felt too worked up to sleep, and despite the late hour, he had slipped quietly out of bed and crept down to Mr. Benedict's study. Mr. Benedict had welcomed Rainey to sit up with him if he had trouble sleeping, and obviously he'd quite expected Rainey to do so. For when Rainey arrived, a cup of hot tea was waiting for him on Mr. Benedict's desk. There was even a little jar of honey, and judging from the way Mr. Benedict's papers stuck to his fingers as he worked, he had already been into it himself. "You have a question for me?" Mr. Benedict said as Rainey sat down. Rainey laughed. "How do you always know?" "I'm not sure," Mr. Benedict admitted. "Perhaps it's a matter of empathy. I know that if I were you, I'd have questions." He scratched the top of his head with one of his pencils. "Though come to think of it, perhaps it's a matter of odds. You seem the type always to have questions. Thus, at any given moment, it's a safe bet for me to assume you have one." "I was wondering if you ever wish you had a family," Rainey sputtered. He hadn't meant to speak so directly, but once he'd begun to ask it, the words just tumbled out. Mr. Benedict nodded. "Certainly. When I was your age, I did, but not anymore." Rainey wasn't sure whether to be comforted or depressed by this revelation. He'd been wondering how it would feel for him to grow up without relatives. You grew out of it then? You stopped wanting it?" "Oh, no, Rainey, you don't grow out of it. It's just that once you acquire a family, you no longer need to wish for one." Rainey was caught off guard. "You have a family?" "Absolutely," Mr. Benedict replied. "You must remember, family is often born of blood, but it doesn't depend on blood, nor is it exclusive of friendship. Family members can be your best friends, you know, and best friends, whether or not they are related to you, can be your family." Rainey had drunk up those words like life-saving medicine. Even though the next morning he would leave on a dangerous mission, even though he knew something terrible was coming down the pike, those words of Mr. Benedict's had made all good things seem possible. Rainey had gone to bed thinking of the people he might one day, if everything turned out all right, considered a part of his family. And now, lying in his dark room at the Institute in an altogether different mood, Rainey finished the letter he had begun to one of those very people. "At least I had you, Miss Perumal, if only for a while. Maybe you weren't my family, but you were the closest thing I had. Maybe that I'll ever have. And now things are awful and seem likely to get worse. And I worry that I'll never have the chance to tell you and what it meant to me." "Rainey," whispered Sticky from the bunk below. Rainey cleared his throat. "Yes?" "Were you having a bad dream? It sounded like you were crying." Rainey wiped his eyes. "I just can't get over what he's done to those poor people." "I know," Sticky said. "It's maddening to think what might be in that journal of his, to think there might be something we could use to stop him. But I know there's no way we can lay hands on it." Rainey sat bolt upright. "Sticky!" Sticky nearly fell out of bed. "What? What is it?" "Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way," Rainey said. "Maybe we don't have to lay hands on it." And that's the end of that chapter. We can see the picture for the next chapter actually shows part of the journal, and we'll see tactical cactupi? I'm not positive on that word there. All right, join me next time. We'll figure out what's going on with the journal.